There is a building that exists only in the mind now. No stone of it remains, no column, no threshold, no fragment of wall. The ground where it stood has been built over so many times that archaeologists argue about which layer of which century might contain its ghost. A discoloration in the soil, a pattern of post holes, some arrangement of rubble that might, if you tilt your head and allow your imagination to fill the gaps, suggest the outline of something once enormous. That is all. That is everything that survives of the greatest library in the history of the world. I have spent a long time thinking about what it means to lose something you never had. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed, if destroyed is even the right word, and I will come back to that. Centuries before any of us were born. The books it held, the scrolls, the papyrus rolls stacked and catalogued and cross-referenced in the greatest act of intellectual collection the ancient world ever attempted, are gone. Not in the way that things go when they are lost and might someday be found. Gone in the way that fire makes things gone. Gone in the way that centuries of neglect and indifference and deliberate destruction make things gone. Gone in the way that means when you reach for them, your hand closes on nothing, and there is no consolation in knowing that they were once there. What was in those scrolls? We know some of it, because fragments survived in quotations and references made by ancient writers who had read them. We know that the library held, at its peak, perhaps 700,000 scrolls, though the number is disputed and probably somewhat inflated, as ancient numbers so often are. We know it held the complete works of Greek dramatists, most of which are now lost. We know it held philosophical and scientific treatises, medical texts, mathematical works, geographical surveys, histories of civilizations that no longer exist, mythologies of peoples whose names we no longer know. We know that Eratosthenes, the chief librarian in the 3rd century before the Common Era, used the library's resources to calculate the circumference of the Earth with a precision that would not be matched for nearly 2,000 years. We know that Archimedes worked in Alexandria, that Euclid wrote his Elements there, that Hero of Alexandria, in the 1st century, designed a steam-powered device, a spinning bronze sphere propelled by jets of steam, that was the earliest documented steam engine in human history, a thing that could have changed everything and changed nothing, because no one could conceive of what to do with it. What we do not know, what we will never know, is what was there that we do not know we are missing. The shape of an absence is always invisible. We do not know what medical knowledge was lost that might have alleviated human suffering across the intervening centuries. We do not know what mathematical insights, what astronomical observations, what philosophical frameworks were preserved in those rolls and are now simply not. We do not know what we would have been as a civilization had those texts survived. This is the question that haunts the ruins of Alexandria, or rather haunts the ground where the ruins no longer are. Not what happened, but what might have happened instead. I want to take you there, to the city as it was at its height, in those extraordinary centuries when it was the undisputed intellectual capital of the world. Because before you can understand what was lost, you have to understand what was built, and why, and what it felt like to walk through those streets and know that you were standing in the place where the world's knowledge was kept. Alexandria was not an ancient city in the way that Babylon was ancient, or Memphis or Ur. It was a planned city, a city that sprang into being not from centuries of gradual accumulation, but from a single act of will, the will of a young Macedonian king who had already conquered most of the known world and was looking at the coast of Egypt and imagining what he could build on it. Alexander the Great founded the city that bears his name in 331 before the Common Era, choosing the site with characteristic strategic intelligence, a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean to the north and a large inland lake to the south, at a point where the Nile Delta met the sea, where the deep natural harbour was sheltered by a long offshore island that could be connected to the mainland by a causeway. He paced out the city's boundaries himself, or so the story goes. The stonemasons had run out of chalk for marking the lines, so Alexander's surveyors used flour, and then a flock of birds descended and ate the flour, which the augurs interpreted as an omen of prosperity, meaning that the city would feed many nations. Alexander accepted this interpretation and moved on to his next conquest, never to return. He never saw the city that bore his name. He died in Babylon 8 years after its founding, at 32, while the city was still being built. But his general Ptolemy, who who took Egypt as his portion when the empire was divided among the successors, understood what Alexander had envisioned and pursued it with the focused intelligence of a man who had watched greatness at close range and knew how to recognize it. Ptolemy the Her's Soter, Ptolemy the Savior, made Alexandria his capital and then made it something more than a capital. He made it the center of the world. The harbor was everything. The lighthouse, the Pharos of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, rose from its island at the harbor's mouth to a height somewhere between 100 and 140 meters, the tallest human-made structure in the world after the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its spire visible from 50 miles out at sea. Ships from every port in the Mediterranean came to Alexandria because Alexandria was where the grain was, where the papyrus was, where the glass and the linen and the spices came through on their way from east to west and back again. And with the ships came people, and with people came ideas, and with ideas came something that Ptolemy I and his son Ptolemy II understood and deliberately cultivated. The possibility of the greatest intellectual institution the world had ever seen. The Mauseon, the Temple of the Muses, from which our word museum descends, was conceived not merely as a library, but as a research institution, a think tank funded by royal patronage, where the greatest scholars of the Greek-speaking world could live and work and argue with one another, and with the accumulated knowledge of all the civilizations that had preceded them. It had colonnaded walkways for philosophical discussion, a great dining hall where the scholars ate together at royal expense, lecture rooms, observation platforms for astronomical study, and at its heart, in structures that have been debated and imagined and reconstructed by scholars for centuries without any consensus, the library itself, the great library, the one we cannot stop thinking about. Ptolemy II, who expanded and systematized what his father had begun, is said to have written to every ruler and every city in the known world, asking them to send to Alexandria any books they possessed, any and all books, on any subject. Ships arriving in the harbour of Alexandria were searched for scrolls, which were taken to the library to be copied. The copies were returned to their owners, the originals kept. A scholar named Demetrius of Phalerum, who had been the governor of Athens and brought to Alexandria the organisational intelligence that Ptolemy needed, was tasked with the work of collection. He was asked how many scrolls the library held, and he answered with the ambition of the project, rather than its current reality. He said he was aiming for 500,000. Think about what that meant. Think about the world in 280 before the Common Era. A world without printing, without electronic transmission, without any means of duplicating a text except by hand, by scribes working with reed pens on papyrus, copying letter by letter, word by word. Every scroll in the library represented hours of a human life bent over a writing surface in careful, concentrated labour. To collect 500,000 scrolls was to collect millions of hours of human attention, organised into a system where any scholar could find what had been written about any subject and put it in conversation with what had been written about every other subject. It was an attempt to hold the entire sum of human knowledge in one place and make it accessible. It was the most ambitious intellectual project in the history of the world up to that point. And for several centuries it succeeded. The scholars who worked in Alexandria in its great period are names that still ring through the history of human thought. Euclid, who systematized all of Greek mathematics into the elements, a text so foundational that it was still being used as a primary mathematics textbook in some schools in the 19th century. Eratosthenes, who not only calculated the circumference of the Earth, but created the concept of geography as a discipline, drawing maps and inventing the system of latitude and longitude that we still use. Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus, that the Earth rotated around the Sun and not the other way around. His work survived in references made by other ancient writers who thought his heliocentric model absurd. Imagine what it meant that a man in the 3rd century before the Common Era had correctly understood the structure of the solar system, had written it down, and that writing survived in the library, and then did not survive. We know he was right. We do not know his reasoning, his observations, the mathematical framework he constructed to support his conclusion. That reasoning is gone. Archimedes came to Alexandria as a young man to study. He went back to Syracuse, and there he spent the rest of his life working on problems in mathematics and engineering that were so far ahead of their time that they were not fully understood until the 17th century. His method for calculating the area under a curve, described in a manuscript called The Method, that was lost for more than 1,000 years and rediscovered by a scholar in 1906, found by accident in a medieval prayer book where monks had scraped off the ancient text to reuse the parchment, anticipates the development of calculus by Newton and Leibniz by nearly 2,000 years. 2,000 years. What might the trajectory of human knowledge have been if Archimedes' mathematical methods had been understood and built upon rather than lost? We cannot know. We can only look at the distance between where we are and where we might have been, and feel the weight of what that gap represents. The library collected not only the works of Greek thinkers, it collected Egyptian religious and astronomical texts, Babylonian mathematical records, the observations of Chaldean astronomers accumulated across centuries of watching the sky. It commissioned translations, most famously the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint, which was produced in Alexandria in the 3rd century before the Common Era by a team of 72 Jewish scholars and became the version of the Bible that most early Christians read. The library was, in this sense, not merely a repository of Greek culture, but an attempt at something unprecedented, the collection of the intellectual heritage of all of human civilization, insofar as that heritage had been written down in one place where it could be studied and compared and built upon. What Alexandria produced in those centuries was not merely a catalogue of existing knowledge, it was new knowledge, generated by the encounter of minds from different traditions working in proximity, reading each other's texts, arguing with each other's conclusions, finding in the juxtaposition of different systems of thought the spark of something none of them would have reached alone. This is what libraries do at their best, not merely store the past but generate the future. The Library of Alexandria, at its height, was generating the future at a rate that had never before been achieved and would not be matched for more than a millennium. I want to try to describe what it was like to walk through that city, because the city is inseparable from the library inseparable from the city. Alexandria at its peak, let us say in the 2nd century before the Common Era, when the library was at its greatest and the city at its most cosmopolitan, was the 2nd largest city in the world, after Rome, with a population of perhaps 500,000 people. It was a city of extraordinary ethnic and cultural diversity. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Persians, Syrians, Italians, Nubians, Arabs, all living in the same streets, trading in the same markets, arguing in the same taverns and colonnades. It was a city of canals, for the lake behind it was connected to the Nile by channels that brought fresh water and fresh goods. It was a city of marble, for the Ptolemies had built it with the ambition of people who wanted their buildings to outlast their memories, covering the limestone substrate of the coastal plain with white marble brought by ship from the quarries of Greece. The Great Canopic Way, the main avenue that ran east to west through the city's heart, was wide enough for several chariots to drive abreast and lined on both sides with colonnades behind which the city's business took place in the shade. The harbour was the city's lungs. Every morning at first light, the dock workers would be there as the ships from Italy and Greece and the Levant and the Black Sea coasts came in on the morning breeze, heavy with grain and timber and wine and olive oil and all the goods that flowed through this city that sat at the intersection of the world's trading routes. The smell of the harbour in the morning was a smell of salt and fish and tar and the particular sharp green smell of rope soaked in brine. The noise was the noise of 100 languages, the creak of rigging, the groan of wooden hulls against stone quays, the shouts of dockmasters and the answering calls of sailors lowering cargo on ropes. And above all of this, visible from almost anywhere in the city, the Ferris lighthouse with its fire burning pale in the morning light, a column of smoke rising straight up in the still air of a calm Mediterranean morning. The royal quarter of the city, the Bruchion, occupied the northeastern section, facing the eastern harbour, and here the great buildings of Ptolemaic ambition were concentrated. The palace complex, the Mausion with its colonnades and dining halls, and somewhere within or adjacent to this complex, the library. We do not know exactly where. This is one of the many painful ironies of Alexandria's history. The city has been so thoroughly built over, layer upon layer, by Romans and Byzantines and Arabs and Ottomans and the modern city of Alexandria that sits on top of all of them. That the actual location of the library building remains uncertain. Archaeologists have found fragments, sections of what may have been the Mausion's colonnades, the suggestion of a large building's foundations at the right location under the modern harbour, but nothing definitive. The greatest library in the world has left no trace that we can point to and say with certainty, here it stood. The scholars of the Mausion lived in rooms provided by the royal court and ate at the court's expense. This was not simple generosity. The Ptolemies understood, with the practical intelligence of rulers who knew that knowledge was power, that attracting the greatest minds of the Greek-speaking world to Alexandria would make Alexandria the intellectual capital of that world, and that being the intellectual capital of the Greek world was the surest form of soft power available to a dynasty of Macedonian Greeks ruling a country of ancient Egyptians. The great scholars came because the resources in Alexandria were available nowhere else. The scrolls, the instruments, the collegial community of other scholars, the royal patronage that freed them from the need to charge for teaching in order to eat. And in return they burnished the prestige of the Ptolemaic court with a brilliance that no military victory could have purchased. The chief librarian was appointed by the king. The position was one of enormous prestige, and the list of chief librarians reads like a catalogue of the most distinguished intellectual figures of the Hellenistic world. Apollonius of Rhodes, who wrote the Argonautica, the great Greek epic of Jason and the Argonauts, the only complete Hellenistic epic to survive, was chief librarian. Aristophanes of Byzantium, who invented the system of punctuation marks and accent marks still used in Greek today, was chief librarian. These were not administrators, they were the leading scholars of their generation, and the directorship of the library was the most intellectually prestigious appointment a scholar could receive. The work of the library was not merely collection but curation, the fierce, contentious, endlessly argued curation of the scholarly tradition. Alexandria was where the texts of the Greek poets and dramatists and philosophers were established in the forms that subsequent generations would inherit. The scholars of the Mausion read and compared and debated manuscripts, trying to establish which version of a text was authentic, which lines were genuine, and which were later interpolations, which author had actually written which work. This philological work, this careful, minute attention to the words on the page, was itself a form of creation, the creation of the stable text that could be passed on. When you read Euclid or Sophocles or Plato in a modern edition, you are reading a text whose lineage runs through the scholars of Alexandria, who first fixed those words in the forms that subsequent copying would preserve, and then, over centuries, it began to end. Not in a single catastrophe. This is the thing that is hardest to hold in the mind about Alexandria, the thing that most retellings of the story get wrong. The Library of Alexandria did not burn in a single great fire and then cease to exist. It declined. It diminished. It was damaged and partially rebuilt and damaged again. It lost funding and then lost more funding. The city that supported it contracted, was conquered, changed hands, changed character. The knowledge it held was not extinguished in one moment, but rather leaked away across 3 or 4 centuries, each loss making the next loss easier. The whole process so gradual that there was never a single moment when anyone could say, today the library ended. The fire of Julius Caesar is the event most commonly associated with the library's destruction. In 48 before the Common Era, Caesar was in Alexandria, pursuing Pompey, caught up in the conflict between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII for the throne of Egypt. There was fighting in the harbour. Caesar ordered fireships set to prevent the Egyptian fleet from blocking his escape route, and the fire spread from the ships to the warehouses on the dock. The ancient sources, Plutarch, Strabo, Livy, do not fully agree on what burned, but some of them mention scrolls, books, a store of texts awaiting export. This was almost certainly not the library itself, which was in the royal quarter some distance from the docks. It may have been an overflow storage facility, a warehouse holding copies or texts awaiting cataloguing. The damage was real, the loss was real. But this was not the end of the library. The library continued to function, under Roman imperial patronage, for at least 2 more centuries after Caesar's fire. It was still operating, still collecting, still producing scholarship in the 1st century of the Common Era. when the Jewish philosopher Philo described visiting Alexandria and encountering its intellectual life. It was still operating in the 2nd century when the geographer Claudius Ptolemy, no relation to the kings, used the library's resources to compile his geographical and astronomical works, including the Almagest and the Geography, which synthesized the accumulated astronomical and geographical knowledge of the ancient world into systematic frameworks that would dominate European thought until the 16th century. This is the measurement of what the library meant. When its resources were finally no longer available, the loss took 1,000 years to even partially fill. The more important damage came from what the Romans, who patronized the library in its early imperial period, gradually ceased to do as the empire's center shifted east and the funds for intellectual patronage dried up. Scrolls that wore out and were not replaced, positions for scholars that went unfilled. The slow cessation of the active work of collection that had been the library's lifeblood in the Ptolemaic period. By the time of the later Roman Empire, the library may have been reduced to a fraction of its former holdings, maintained more as a symbol of Alexandria's glorious past than as the living intellectual institution it had once been. There was a woman in all of this. Her name was Hypatia, and she is the last clear human face we can put to the tradition of Alexandrian scholarship. She was born sometime around 360 of the Common Era, the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, a mathematician and astronomer who was himself one of the last scholars working in the Mausion tradition. Theon taught his daughter everything he knew, and she exceeded him. She became the leading mathematician and philosopher in Alexandria, writing commentaries on Diophantus and Apollonius that are the only reason we have access to those mathematicians' work at all. Her commentaries preserve texts that would otherwise be entirely lost. She taught publicly in the Neoplatonic tradition, attracting students not only from Alexandria, but from across the Mediterranean world. Her students loved her with a devotion that the correspondence of one of them, Synesius of Cyrene, makes deeply vivid even across 16 centuries. Letters full of mathematical questions and philosophical discussions, and a personal warmth that transforms the abstract figure of the female philosopher of Alexandria into a specific human being, a person with a particular voice and a particular mind. She also attracted enemies. Alexandria in the early 5th century was a city in religious and political crisis, a city where the ancient pagan intellectual tradition, represented by Hypatia, and the new Christian political power, represented by the Bishop Cyril, were in direct conflict, and where that conflict was playing out in violence. In 415 of the Common Era, Hypatia was returning home from a journey when a mob seized her, dragged her to a church, and murdered her. The accounts of her death are various, and all of them are brutal. She was stripped and her flesh was scraped from her bones with oyster shells, or tiles, or roof shingles, depending on which source you read. Her remains were burned. Hypatia's murder did not end the library. The library, in whatever diminished form it still existed by 415, outlasted her by some decades. But her death was a symbol of something real, the end of the civic tolerance for the pagan intellectual tradition that the library represented, the end of the institutional support and the social space within which that tradition could survive. The last scholars of the Mausion tradition dispersed gradually over the following century, going to Athens, to Constantinople, carrying with them whatever they could carry. And in 642, when the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria for the Caliph Omar, whatever remained of the ancient library's holdings, and by this point very little may have remained, passed into Arab hands, where some of it was translated into Arabic, and thus survived in a transformed form, and some of it was lost entirely. The story that Caliph Omar ordered the library burned because any book that agreed with the Quran was superfluous and any that disagreed was heretical is almost certainly a later invention, a story told by Crusade-era Christian writers to blacken the reputation of Islam. The evidence for this story is weak and late, and the Arab scholars of the early medieval period were in fact among the most important preservers of ancient knowledge, translating and studying Greek scientific texts precisely because they valued them. If the library had still existed in 642 in anything like its ancient form, it would have survived the Arab conquest. The fact that nothing remained to be burned suggests that by that point the work of destruction and dispersal was already long complete. What survived? Something. More than nothing, less than everything. The Greek dramatists survive in fragments: 7 plays of Sophocles, 7 of Aeschylus, 17 of Euripides, out of the perhaps 300 plays that those 3 men wrote. We have every word of Plato that was written down, and enough of Aristotle to build a philosophical tradition on. We have Euclid's Elements, Apollonius's Conics, Archimedes' surviving works, Eratosthenes' measurements recorded in the writings of others. We have the Septuagint, which helped shape the New Testament and thus the entire subsequent history of Western civilization. We have Ptolemy's Almagest and geography. We have Hypatia's commentaries, which preserved mathematical works that would otherwise be gone. These survivals were not accidents. They were the result of individual decisions made by individual people. A Byzantine monk choosing which texts to copy before the parchment wore out. An Arab scholar deciding which Greek text was worth translating into Arabic. A medieval librarian cataloguing a collection and preventing certain items from being discarded. The transmission of ancient knowledge from antiquity to the modern world is a story of human choices made under conditions of scarcity and crisis, of what seemed worth preserving and what did not, of what was legible to the people doing the preserving and what was not. Texts that survived in the Muslim world came back to the Christian West through the translating schools of medieval Spain and Sicily. Texts preserved in Constantinople arrived in Italy in the years around the fall. Just as the manuscripts fleeing Constantinople enriched the Italian Renaissance, so the texts that scholars managed to carry out of Alexandria in the century of its decline seeded the later traditions that would eventually recover much of what had been lost. But the gap is real, and the gap is vast. The works of the pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Democritus, the thinkers whose ideas about the nature of matter and motion and being were the foundation on which Plato and Aristotle built, survive only in fragments quoted by later writers. Democritus proposed an atomic theory of matter in the 5th century before the Common Era that was astonishingly close to the theory developed by Dalton in 1808. His work, if it had survived intact, might have changed the history of chemistry and physics by centuries. It did not survive. It survived in fragments. We know he thought this. We do not know how he argued for it. The medical tradition of the ancient world, which at Alexandria achieved a level of sophistication in anatomy and physiology that would not be reached again until the 16th century. Herophilus, working in Alexandria in the 3rd century before the Common Era, correctly described the role of the brain as the center of the nervous system, performed dissections, perhaps even vivisections, that gave him knowledge of human anatomy that his successors did not match for over 1,000 years. This tradition survived in a single author, Galen, whose works were preserved and transmitted through the Arabic tradition and then back to medieval Europe, where they dominated medicine for 14 centuries. A single voice, preserving what a tradition had built. Imagine the wealth of insight that did not find its way into Galen's text. Imagine what else was there and is now not. The astronomical tradition. Alexandria was where the most careful and comprehensive astronomical observations of the ancient world were recorded and analysed. The Babylonian astronomical records that arrived in Alexandria and were studied and synthesized by Hipparchus and Ptolemy represented centuries of careful skywatching, noting the positions of planets and the dates of eclipses with the methodical patience of people who understood that the sky was a clock and that reading it required generations of accumulated data. Hipparchus, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, used Babylonian eclipse records to discover the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that shifts the position of the stars relative to the Sun over a cycle of about 26,000 years. This discovery required access to astronomical records spanning centuries. Alexandria had those records. Alexandria was the only place that had those records. When Alexandria declined, those records, the raw data of centuries of human skywatching, were either lost or survived in the reduced, synthesized form in which Ptolemy preserved them in the Almagest. The raw data is gone. I find myself returning, again and again, to a particular thought. The ancient world was not primitive. This is the thing that the story of Alexandria most insistently teaches, and it is the thing that is hardest for us to really hold in our minds. We carry, almost unconsciously, an assumption that human intelligence has been advancing in a straight line, that the people of the ancient world were clever but limited, that they were working up toward us, that we represent the highest point of human intellectual development, and that everything before us was preparatory. Alexandria refutes this assumption. The people who worked in the Mausion were not working up toward us, they were working outward from themselves, following the logic of the problems they found interesting, and in many directions they went further than the next 2,000 years would go. They had atomic theory, they had the heliocentric model, they had steam power, they had a calculation of the Earth's circumference that was within a few % of the correct value. They had anatomical knowledge that would not be recovered until the Renaissance. None of this was primitive, none of this was preliminary. It was complete, sophisticated intellectual achievement, which happened to be housed in a building that no longer exists in a city that has been built over so many times that the building's very location is uncertain. This is the thing about losing the Library of Alexandria that goes beyond the specific texts, beyond the specific intellectual achievements. What we lost was a certain kind of momentum. The library was not just a storage facility, it was an institution that generated intellectual progress by the systematic accumulation and cross-referencing of human knowledge, that created the conditions for discovery by putting the right minds in contact with the right texts at the right time. That institution was destroyed, gradually, without anyone choosing to destroy it in its entirety, by the combined weight of political change and religious transformation, an economic decline, and simple indifference. And when it was gone, the momentum it had generated, that extraordinary acceleration of human intellectual achievement that had been running since the 3rd century before the Common Era, stopped. The Dark Ages that followed were not inevitable. They were the consequence of a specific loss of institutional infrastructure, of the physical places and the economic support and the social tolerance for intellectual inquiry that had made Alexandria possible. The library was rebuilt, in a sense eventually. The great universities of medieval Islam, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the libraries of Cordoba and Cairo, recreated something of what Alexandria had been, preserving and extending the tradition that Alexandria had begun. The medieval European university system, which traced its intellectual lineage partly through those Islamic institutions, created new versions of the Mausian's collegial community of scholars. The printing press, in the 15th century, finally made it impossible to destroy knowledge by burning a single building, distributing it across thousands of copies in dozens of cities. The internet has made it impossible, in theory, for any single catastrophe to destroy a text that has been uploaded to it. We have, over the centuries, rebuilt the infrastructure for the accumulation and transmission of human knowledge more robustly than the ancient world ever managed. But we built it in a world that was already missing something. We built it on a foundation that had a gap in it, a gap shaped exactly like what was in those scrolls. And because we cannot see the shape of an absence, we do not know exactly what we are missing. We know that our mathematics, our astronomy, our medicine, our physics might have developed differently if the tradition of Alexandrian scholarship had continued unbroken from the 3rd century before the Common Era to the present. We know that certain things we think of as discoveries, the heliocentric model, the atomic theory of matter, certain principles of anatomy, were rediscovered, found again by people who did not know that what they were finding had been found before and lost. We know that the gap was real. What I cannot stop thinking about is not the great names, it is the unknown ones. The scholars whose names do not appear in any surviving text, whose work was quoted by no one who survived, whose lives were spent in that building reading those scrolls and thinking those thoughts and writing those words, and whose existence we know of only because we know that the library employed them, and whose work is simply gone. The woman who catalogued the Babylonian astronomical records, and in doing so noticed a pattern that no one before her had seen. The physician who performed dissections and understood something about the cardiovascular system that would not be understood again until Harvey in 1628. The mathematician who found a proof that the great mathematicians of the 17th century would spend their careers looking for. These people existed. They thought these thoughts. The library had their work, and then it did not. There is a quality of grief that is different from the grief for things you knew and lost. It is the grief for the thing you never had, for the potential that was extinguished before it could reach you, for the conversation that was cut off before it could become the idea that would have changed everything. This is the grief of Alexandria, not the grief of loss, though there is that too, but the grief of what might have been, of the world we did not get to live in because the building burned, or rather, because the building was neglected and defunded and left to decline, which is a different kind of fire but burns just as thoroughly. The new Library of Alexandria, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, opened in 2002, a great curved building of granite and glass on the shores of the Mediterranean, near where the ancient library may have stood. It is beautiful. It is serious and well-funded and staffed by committed scholars. It holds millions of books and is connected to the digital networks that now distribute the texts of human knowledge across the planet in a form no single catastrophe can destroy. I think it is a good thing, this new library, and I think the people who built it understood what they were doing, not restoring what was lost, because that cannot be restored, but insisting that the impulse that built the original, the impulse to collect and preserve and make accessible the knowledge of the world, is worth returning to, worth insisting on, worth building in stone and glass on the Mediterranean shore where the Pharaoh's fire once burned. But when I think of the new library, I also think of what was not recovered when it was built, of the 700,000 scrolls that are not in it, of Aristarchus's heliocentric proofs and Democritus's atomic arguments, and the Babylonian astronomical records that Hipparchus used to discover the precession of the equinoxes, and that no one has seen since the Roman period, of the plays of Sophocles and the philosophical dialogues of Aristotle and the anatomical observations of Herophilus, of all the unnamed scholars and all their unnamed thoughts, the Pharos lighthouse, the other wonder of ancient Alexandria, the other thing that is completely gone, was still standing, though damaged, into the 14th century, when an earthquake finally brought it down. For nearly 1,500 years it had stood, its fire tended through the night by the lighthouse keepers, visible from 50 miles out at sea, guiding ships safely into the harbour of the city that held the world's knowledge. I think about that fire a great deal, about the people who tended it, generation after generation, keeping it burning through the night so that ships could find their way, about what it meant to hold a light against the dark, about the fact that eventually, inevitably, the earthquake came and the lighthouse fell, and the harbour that it had guided ships into for a millennium was no longer the harbour at the centre of the world's knowledge, because the world's knowledge was no longer there. What remains is the knowledge that it existed, the knowledge of what it held, insofar as we can reconstruct that from fragments and quotations and references in texts that survived, the knowledge of what it produced, the mathematical and astronomical and medical and philosophical tradition that flowed from it and changed the world, even in its diminished, partially transmitted, fragmentary form, and the knowledge of what we are missing, the precise shape of which we can never determine, only feel as a kind of negative pressure, an absence that presses on the edges of what we know and reminds us that what we know is not all there is. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me try to walk you through it more slowly. Let me try to give it the time it deserves. The city that Ptolemy I built after Alexander's death was not built quickly or cheaply. It was built with the deliberate magnificence of a dynasty that understood that architecture was argument, that what you built said what you believed about your place in the world. The Ptolemies believed they stood at the centre, and they built accordingly. The city's grid was laid out by the architect Democritus of Rhodes, who had been Alexander's city planner, the man who had also proposed, in one of the more extraordinary pieces of architectural megalomania in the ancient world, that Mount Athos in northern Greece should be carved into a statue of Alexander so large that one of his hands would hold a city of 10,000 people. Alexander declined. But the man who had conceived of that project brought to Alexandria an ambition in scale that was, in the built city, somewhat more restrained and considerably more functional. The Canopic Way, the great east-west avenue, was 100 feet wide, wider than most city blocks, wide enough that the morning processions and the market crowds and the military parades could all move through simultaneously without crowding. The cross streets were laid out at right angles, creating a city of regular insulae, city blocks, within which the buildings rose in the characteristic Hellenistic style. Colonnaded ground floors open to the street, upper floors set back, the whole creating a covered walkway that sheltered pedestrians from the Mediterranean summer sun and from the occasional winter rain. The columns were not the rough local stone of most Egyptian buildings, but marble, white and pale grey and rose, brought at enormous expense from the quarries of the Aegean world. A Jewish quarter occupied the northeastern section of the city, behind its own walls, housing a Jewish population that was, at its height, perhaps the largest Jewish community outside Palestine. Perhaps 100,000 people or more. The Jews of Alexandria were not a persecuted minority in the early Ptolemaic period. They held citizenship, operated in the city's commercial life, and produced a cultural tradition of extraordinary richness that blended the Hebrew scriptural tradition with the philosophical tradition of the Greek world in ways that would have enormous consequences for the subsequent history of both Judaism and Christianity. Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, created a synthesis of Platonic philosophy and Hebrew scripture that influenced the early Christian theologians more than almost any other thinker. His intellectual project was possible because he lived in a city where both traditions were available in their full depth, where you could read Plato and the Pentateuch in the same library, in the same language. The Egyptian population of the city lived primarily in the Rikotis district, the southwestern quarter, built on and around the site of the original Egyptian village that had existed before Alexander arrived. They maintained their own temples, their own priests, their own religious traditions, largely parallel to the Greek cultural life of the rest of the city. The Ptolemies, with characteristic political intelligence, patronized the Egyptian religious tradition alongside the Greek one, presenting themselves as pharaohs to their Egyptian subjects and as Hellenistic kings to their Greek subjects, wearing different crowns for different audiences, performing in different languages the rituals of different traditions, the whole sustained by the economic engine of a city that grew richer every year as more of the world's trade passed through its harbour. The royal harbour, the private harbour of the Ptolemaic court, separated from the great commercial harbour by a promontory, was where the warships of the royal fleet were kept, alongside the royal pleasure barges and the diplomatic vessels that carried ambassadors and gifts between Alexandria and the other great powers of the Hellenistic world, the Seleucid Empire of Syria and Persia, the kingdoms of Macedonia and Pergamon, the city-states of the Greek mainland, the growing power of Rome in the west. Alexandria's diplomacy was backed by something more reliable than military force alone. It was backed by the grain supply of Egypt, which fed Rome and much of the Mediterranean world, and this economic leverage gave the Ptolemies a durability that their more militarily aggressive neighbours sometimes found baffling. The Mausoleum itself, the institution that contained or was adjacent to the library, occupied a portion of the royal quarter, close enough to the palace that the scholars could be invited to dine with the king, and far enough from the commercial city that they could work without too much interruption. The description of it that survives in the geographer Strabo, who visited Alexandria in the late 1st century before the Common Era, speaks of a large colonnaded hall, an exedra, a semicircular seating area with benches, where the scholars met for discussion, a common dining room, and gardens. This is frustratingly vague. Strabo was not writing a description of the Mausoleum for the benefit of future archaeologists. He was writing a geography, and the Mausoleum was only one item among many. The library itself, the actual physical building or buildings that held the scrolls, he does not clearly describe. We know that the scrolls were housed on shelves in rooms, and that the shelves were organised by subject and by author, and that there was a catalogue, a great catalogue called the Copernicus, compiled by the poet and scholar Callimachus in the early 3rd century before the Common Era, organising all the holdings of the library by genre and listing each work with information about its author and its contents. The Copernicus filled 120 scrolls. It was itself one of the great scholarly achievements of the ancient world, the first comprehensive bibliography in the history of literature, and it is lost. We have fragments of it, references to it, quotations from it in later authors, but the thing itself, the catalogue of the greatest library in the ancient world, is as gone as the library it catalogued. Callimachus is a figure worth pausing over. He was a poet of considerable refinement and considerable influence, the kind of poet whose formal innovations shaped the entire subsequent tradition of Greek and Latin poetry. Ovid and Catullus and Propertius were all reading him and learning from him, but his work in the library, the organisational and scholarly work of the Copernicus, was the work of a different kind of mind, a systematic, categorizing, exhaustive mind that wanted to know everything that had been written and to organize it so that others could find it. He was the man who made the library navigable, who transformed it from a vast and potentially unmanageable collection into a working research tool. The Pinnaces was the card catalogue of the ancient world, the index that made everything else accessible. Without it, even the scrolls that survived would have been harder to use. With it, the library was not just a collection of texts, but a system for finding knowledge. The system for acquiring texts was equally systematic. Ptolemy III, Ptolemy Euergetes, the benefactor, who ruled from 246 to 222 before the Common Era, is said to have issued a decree requiring that any ship arriving in the harbour of Alexandria submit its books for copying. The copies were given to the ship's owners, the originals were kept by the library and stamped from the ships. This policy, whether it operated exactly as the ancient sources describe or in some modified form, reflects the seriousness with which the Ptolemaic court treated the project of collection. They were not merely buying books, they were intercepting knowledge in transit, capturing it at the point where it flowed through Alexandria, making copies in a double sense, copies of the texts themselves and a copy of the world's intellectual commerce running through the library's holdings. The great scandal of Ptolemy's text acquisition, and scandal is not too strong a word because ancient authors treated it as such, involved the Athenians. Athens had official copies of the plays of the three great Attic tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. These were the texts used for official revivals of the plays, certified authentic, held in public trust. Ptolemy III asked to borrow them and offered a substantial deposit in silver as security for their return. The Athenians, apparently trusting in the deposit, agreed. Ptolemy kept the originals, sent back careful copies, and forfeited the deposit. The Athenians were apparently furious, and the story was still being told, with a mixture of outrage and wry admiration, centuries later. What the story tells us, beyond the obvious point about Ptolemy's willingness to cheat in a good cause, is how seriously these texts were taken, how valuable the authentic copy was understood to be, how much it mattered which version of a play was the real one. The text was not just content, it was an artifact, a thing with a specific material history, and its authenticity mattered. The scholars who worked in this institution were not all Greek, or rather, they were all working in Greek, because Greek was the international language of scholarship in the Hellenistic world, the way Latin would be in medieval Europe and English is in the scientific world today. But they came from everywhere that Greek scholarship reached. There were Egyptians who had learnt Greek and worked in the Greek tradition, while also maintaining access to the Egyptian priestly tradition of learning, which was itself enormously old and sophisticated. There were Jews who brought to the Mausian the tradition of textual study and commentary that was the foundation of their religion, and whose encounter with Greek philosophy would produce Philo, and more distantly, the intellectual tradition of early Christianity. There were men from the kingdoms of Western Asia, from Pergamon and Antioch and beyond, bringing with them the Babylonian astronomical and mathematical traditions that the library collected and that Greek scholars used to produce some of their most important work. This diversity was not incidental, it was structural to what the library was trying to do. You cannot collect the knowledge of the world if you only speak one language and only value one tradition. The library worked because it was genuinely cosmopolitan, because the scholars in it were genuinely in contact with multiple intellectual traditions, and because the Ptolemaic court had the political wisdom to maintain a city where this kind of cosmopolitanism was possible. When that cosmopolitanism began to break down, when religious conflict made it harder for different communities to work together, when political instability made the royal patronage unreliable, when the economic decline of the later empire made the funding precarious, the library's capacity to do what it was built to do diminished with it. The library was only as capable as the city it sat in, and the city was only as capable as the political and economic system that sustained it. I want to give you one more figure, one more specific human being standing in the shadow of those scrolls, making use of what they contained. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, chief librarian from approximately 240 to 194 before the Common Era, is perhaps the most extraordinary single intellect to have worked in the Mausian. He was called Beta by his colleagues, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, because he was, they said, the second best in everything, second to the best mathematician, second to the best poet, second to the best geographer. This was intended as a gentle insult, and it says something about the competitive atmosphere of the Mausian that it was delivered as such. In any other context, in any other century, a man who was second only to the absolute best in mathematics, poetry, and geography would have been considered the outstanding intellect of his age. Eratosthenes is famous for calculating the circumference of the Earth, and the calculation is famous enough that it is worth pausing over what it actually involved. He had read, somewhere in the library's holdings, that in the city of Syene, modern Aswan, in southern Egypt, at noon on the summer solstice, the sun was directly overhead. A vertical stick cast no shadow, and the sun was visible at the bottom of a deep well. He knew that in Alexandria, at the same moment, a vertical stick did cast a shadow. He measured the angle of that shadow, approximately 7 degrees, or about 1/50th of a full circle. He knew, or arranged to measure, the distance from Alexandria to Syene, approximately 5,000 stades. A full circle, he reasoned, would be 50 times the distance from Alexandria to Syene, or 250,000 stades. The stade varied in length between different Greek cities, which is why historians still argue about the precise accuracy of his result. But the best estimate of his stade measurement puts his calculation of the Earth's circumference within a few percent of the correct value. What I want you to notice about this calculation is not just its brilliance, which is extraordinary, but the resources it required. It required knowing that Syene had the shadow-free noon on the solstice, which he knew from a text in the library. It required a measurement of the distance from Alexandria to Syene, which the Ptolemaic state could provide through its surveying apparatus. It required mathematical tools, Euclidean geometry, specifically, that were available in the library. It required the intellectual environment of the Mausian, where a geographer could discuss his idea with mathematicians and astronomers and surveyors and test it against their knowledge. The calculation was not a solitary act of genius. It was the product of an institution. It was what the library made possible, the synthesis of information from multiple sources, held in the same place, accessible to a single mind that could put them in conversation with each other. That is what we lost when we lost the library. Not just the texts, the institution, the machine for generating knowledge by accumulation and cross-reference and collegial argument. It took the world approximately 1,200 years to rebuild something functionally equivalent in the universities of medieval Europe and the great libraries of the Islamic world. 1,200 years. One might ask what we were doing for 1,200 years, and the answer is, the best we could, with what we had, which was considerably less than what had been in those rooms, in that city, beside that harbour, under that lighthouse fire, the lighthouse, the Pharos. I keep returning to it because it seems to me the right metaphor for what the library was and what it lost. A lighthouse does not guarantee safe passage. It does not remove the rocks or calm the sea or prevent the storm. It only provides the knowledge of where you are, the orientation that makes safe passage possible. Without it, ships that might have made harbour are lost. The library was a lighthouse, not of the sea but of the mind, a fixed point of accumulated knowledge by which thinkers could orient themselves, understand where they were in the long journey of human inquiry, see what had already been done and what remained to be done. When it went dark, people were still thinking, still working, still trying to understand the world, but they were doing it for a very long time without knowing where they were. Somewhere in the ground beneath the modern city of Alexandria, beneath the streets and the apartment blocks and the cafes and the markets and the harbour full of modern ships, are the stones of the building. Perhaps not many stones, perhaps a discoloration, a ghost of a foundation. The layers of occupation go so deep there, and the last great earthquake that reshaped the coastline sent so much of ancient Alexandria into the sea, that the library may not be findable at all even with the best archaeological methods available. It is under there, or it is under the harbour, or it is simply gone, dissolved into the soil that grew over it across the long centuries of neglect. What survives is what was in the scrolls that were saved. What survives is the mathematical tradition, fragmentary but real. The astronomical tradition, synthesized and reduced but present. The medical tradition, narrow but continuing. The philosophical tradition, partial but alive. What survives is the idea of the library itself, The idea that you could collect the world's knowledge and put it in one place and make it available to anyone who could read, that knowledge was not the private property of temples or courts, but a common resource that grew more valuable the more widely it was shared. This idea did not die with the library. It survived in the concept of the university, in the ideal of the public library, in the design of the internet, in the open access movement in academic publishing. The specific contents were lost. The animating idea was not, but I will not pretend that this consolation is complete. The idea without the contents is a framework without the building. We have the walls but not the rooms, the catalogue without the books, the shape of the absence without its filling, and somewhere in the negative space of what is missing, in the intellectual history that did not happen, in the discoveries that were delayed by a millennium or more, in the world that was not built because the knowledge that would have built it was in a building that no longer exists. Somewhere in that space is the grief that Alexandria properly deserves. Not dramatic grief, not the grief of a single catastrophe, but the long, slow grief of gradual loss, of the kind that happens without anyone choosing it and without anyone being able to stop it. The way civilizations decline when no one is watching carefully enough, and when the things that matter are allowed, by slow degrees, to go dark. The fire in the Pharos burned for 1500 years. When the earthquake brought the lighthouse down in the 14th century, the harbour entrance it had guarded for all those centuries was no longer the entrance to the harbour of the world's knowledge. The knowledge was elsewhere by then, scattered, partial, living in other buildings in other cities, surviving in forms its original authors might not have recognised. The lighthouse had kept burning long after there was anything left to guide ships toward. There is something in that image that I find both devastating and oddly comforting. The light kept burning, someone kept tending it, generation after generation, long after the institution it had illuminated had declined and transformed and finally dispersed. Long after the scrolls were gone, the fire continued. This seems to me to be what human beings do with the things that matter to them. They keep the fire going, even when they can no longer fully remember what the fire was lit to serve. They keep tending the light because the light was important once, and something in them knows this, even when the detailed memory of why it was important has faded. We are still tending the light. The new library, the universities, the search engines, the open access journals, the effort to put the world's knowledge in a form that can be searched and found by anyone, anywhere. All of this is a continuation of what Ptolemy the Fast imagined when he looked at that stretch of Mediterranean coastline and thought, here is where the world's knowledge will be gathered. Here is where the ships will come, and the scholars will come, and the texts will come. And out of all of that accumulation will come something that could not have existed otherwise. Something new and true and important, generated by the encounter of everything that was known with the minds that could understand it. He was right about that. He was right that it was possible, and that it was worth doing, and that the light it would cast would be worth the fire. What he could not have known was how long the darkness would last after the light went out. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. But before the night gets too dark, let me take you back into the city. Let me walk you through it one more time, more slowly, through the streets that no longer exist, past the buildings that are not there, into the rooms where the scrolls were kept. Because the grief of Alexandria is best understood not as an abstraction, but as a specific loss, specific rooms, specific objects, specific human beings, who spent their days in proximity to the accumulated intelligence of the ancient world. The scrolls themselves were beautiful objects. This is something easy to forget when we think of libraries. We think of our own libraries, of paper books on shelves, and the scroll is an abstraction. But the scroll was a crafted thing, a thing made with care and skill. The papyrus was harvested from the Nile Delta. The pith of the papyrus plant cut into thin strips and layered at right angles to each other, and pressed and dried until it formed a surface that could take ink. The best papyrus, the hieratica, the priestly grade, was smooth and pale, almost like fine linen, capable of holding the finest writing without bleeding. The scrolls were rolled around wooden or ivory rods, stored upright in cylindrical containers of wood or leather, and the containers were labelled with small tags showing the title and the author. Callimachus's Pinnacus, among its other achievements, provided the information that went on those tags. The scribes who produced the copies in the library's scriptorium, the copying room, the place where the texts that arrived were reproduced and the collection was maintained, were trained professionals of a very high order. Their work was, in the ancient world, a skilled trade, and the best scribes were highly valued. The speed at which the library could copy texts, the accuracy with which it could do so, the quality of the copies it produced, these were practical constraints on what the institution could accomplish. And they were real constraints in a world without printing presses. Every scroll in the library was a human being's work. Every scroll lost was a human being's work erased. The scholars who came to Alexandria to work were not, by and large, students. The Mausian was not a teaching institution in the way we understand that term. It was a research institution, and the people in it were already accomplished. They came because the resources were there, because the colleagues were there, because the library itself was there, and you could not do the kind of work they wanted to do anywhere else. A young scholar who had shown promise in Athens or in Rhodes or in Pergamon might make his way to Alexandria seeking patronage, seeking the access to the collection that no other place could provide. And if he found it, if the chief librarian or the king's representatives decided his work was worth supporting, he stayed. He was given his rooms and his meals and his access to the scrolls and his place in the collegial life of the Mausian, and in return he produced the scholarship that justified the institution's existence. The debates in the Mausian's exedra, that semicircular hall where the scholars gathered to argue, must have been extraordinary. These were not polite academic disagreements. The ancient sources suggest considerable ferocity in intellectual dispute, considerable personal animosity between competing schools, the full range of human competitiveness and vanity playing out in the specifically intellectual arena of philosophical and scientific argument. Callimachus and Apollonius of Rhodes, both poets, both scholars, both working in the library at the same time, apparently hated each other with an intensity that went well beyond collegial disagreement. Their dispute was partly aesthetic. Callimachus believed in short, polished, erudite poetry. Apollonius believed in the long, epic form, and partly personal. And it was the kind of dispute that happens when two talented, ambitious people are forced into proximity by their shared pursuit of the same kind of excellence. These disputes were generative. The best intellectual work is often produced in the context of serious disagreement, where you are forced to think more carefully about your own position because someone you respect is challenging it. The Mausian's community was dense enough, diverse enough, and competitive enough to generate that kind of productive friction. When it was working well, it was working as an engine of intellectual progress, burning the fuel of human ambition and curiosity and rivalry, and producing, as exhaust, new knowledge. I want to try to describe what was lost in the medical tradition, because this is perhaps where the human cost of the library's destruction is most viscerally apparent. The medical school of Alexandria, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, achieved a level of anatomical knowledge that was not matched until Andreas Vesalius published his Anatomical Atlas in 1543, a gap of nearly 1800 years. Herophilus of Chalcedon, working in Alexandria around 300 before the Common Era, was the first person in the Western tradition to systematically dissect human bodies. He described the brain, distinguishing between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. He described the nervous system, distinguishing between sensory and motor nerves. He described the heart and the pulse and the difference between veins and arteries. He described the ovaries and the fallopian tubes, the liver, the duodenum, a word that comes from his measurement of it, 12 finger breadths in length. He wrote extensively on all of these discoveries. His works did not survive. We know what he found because later medical writers, Galen, above all, quoted him. Galen's medical writings, enormous and systematic and deeply indebted to the Alexandrian tradition, are what the medieval world had instead of Herophilus and his colleague Erasistratus, who had further developed the understanding of the cardiovascular system and come very close to understanding the circulation of the blood. Galen preserved a synthesis of their work, but a synthesis is not the original. The original reasonings, the original observations, the specific arguments by which Herophilus established his anatomical conclusions, these are gone. We have his results, filtered through another mind, without his methods. What difference does it make, whether you have the results or the methods? The results are what you use when you treat a patient. The methods are what you use when you want to go further, when you want to find things that the original discoverer did not find, when you want to build on the discovery rather than merely accept it. Galen's synthesis of the Alexandrian medical tradition gave the medieval world a medical system that was far better than nothing. But it was a finished system, presented as authoritative, with its working hidden. It did not invite the kind of critical scrutiny that might have extended it, because it came without the tools for extension. The tradition of anatomical dissection and empirical investigation that had produced the Alexandrian medical discoveries was not transmitted with the discoveries themselves. It had to be reinvented, painfully, over centuries, before anyone could go further than Herophilus had already gone. The astronomical tradition suffered a similar loss in a similar way. Hipparchus, working in Alexandria and Rhodes in the 2nd century before the Common Era, is the greatest astronomer of the ancient world, greater even than Ptolemy who came after him, because Ptolemy, however skilled and systematic, was building on foundations that Hipparchus had laid, and often simply restating what Hipparchus had already established. Hipparchus's works are almost entirely lost. We know them through Ptolemy's Almagest, which quotes and criticizes and builds on them. This is enormously valuable, but it is again a synthesis rather than the original, and the things that Hipparchus noticed, which Ptolemy did not think worth preserving, are gone along with Hipparchus's actual texts. What we know about Hipparchus is that he had access to the Babylonian astronomical records held in the library. Centuries of careful observations of planetary positions and eclipses and star positions, the accumulated data of the Babylonian astronomical tradition, which was the most systematic and careful skywatching the ancient world produced. He used those records to discover the precession of the equinoxes. He created the first star catalogue in the Greek tradition, mapping the positions of perhaps 850 stars with a precision that was not improved upon for nearly 2,000 years. He developed trigonometry as a mathematical tool for astronomical calculation. He may have invented the table of chords, which is the ancient equivalent of the sine table, as a practical tool for computing angles in astronomical problems. All of this required the library. None of it survived the library. The Babylonian astronomical records that made Hipparchus's work possible, those centuries of raw observational data, did not survive in any form that the modern world has access to. Some Babylonian astronomical tablets have survived in Mesopotamia and are in museums in Berlin and London and elsewhere, giving us samples of the data that the Babylonian astronomers collected over centuries. But the collection that arrived in Alexandria and that Hipparchus used was a much larger body of material, and whatever portion of it was held in the library is gone. The raw data of centuries of human skywatching, which constituted perhaps the single most valuable scientific archive in the ancient world, is lost. I keep coming back to the word lost, and I keep feeling that it is not quite right. Lost implies that the thing could be found, that somewhere, in a cave or under a collapsed building, or in the archive of a monastery that has not been fully catalogued, the scrolls might still exist, waiting to be rediscovered. This is not entirely impossible. Papyrus scrolls have survived in Egypt for 2,500 years, when they were buried in dry desert conditions. The discovery in 1900 of the Oxyrhynchus papyri, a treasure of ancient texts preserved in the rubbish mounds of an Egyptian village, showed that remarkable things can survive in remarkable conditions. And Alexandria's dry Mediterranean climate was not as hostile to papyrus as the climate of northern Europe would have been. But Alexandria is not in the desert. It is a port city, humid and built over again. And the conditions for papyrus survival there are essentially nil. What was in the building is not under the building in a legible form. It has decomposed or burned or both, and the information it contained is gone in the way that information is gone when its material substrate no longer exists. It will not be found. The treasure hunters and the optimists and the people who point to the underwater archaeology of ancient Alexandria. The earthquakes sent much of the ancient city into the harbour, and divers have found columns and sphinxes and the remains of ancient quays, are looking for something that is not there. The columns are there, the scrolls are not. This is the hardest thing to accept about the Library of Alexandria. Not that it was destroyed, but that the destruction is permanent. We are not waiting for the discovery that will give us back Aristarchus's heliocentric proofs, or Herophilus's anatomical works, or the catalogue Callimachus, compiled of the 700,000 scrolls. We are not in a temporary state of ignorance that future archaeology will remedy. We are in the condition that we will permanently be in, a condition in which those texts do not exist and cannot be recovered. The gap is not a wound that will heal, it is an amputation. And yet, and I want to end with this thought because it seems to me important, the fact that the loss is permanent does not make the library itself less significant. The fact that it is gone does not mean it didn't matter. The fact that most of what it held is lost does not mean that what it produced has not shaped the world we live in. We are downstream of Alexandria in more ways than we usually acknowledge. The mathematical tradition that flows from Euclid and Archimedes to Newton and Leibniz and everything that follows from them, it flows through Alexandria. The astronomical tradition that flows from Hipparchus and Ptolemy to Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler, it flows through Alexandria. The medical tradition that underlies modern medicine, however remotely, it flows through Alexandria. The philosophical tradition of Plato and Aristotle, preserved and transmitted and argued over across 2,000 years, it was preserved and transmitted from Alexandria, in the copies that the scholars made and the scholars who fled carried with them as the city declined. We are what we are partly because of what was in those rooms, and we are less than we might have been because of what was lost from those rooms. Both things are true simultaneously. The library was a gift to the future, and the loss of the library was a wound inflicted on the future by the indifference and the violence and the gradual erosion of the present. We are the future that received both the gift and the wound, and we carry both of them, and we do not always know which is which. Outside, the Mediterranean is still the same Mediterranean. The trade winds still blow across it in the same patterns, the same ones that brought the ships into the harbour of Alexandria for 700 years. The water is the same water. The light on the water at evening is the same light that fell on the harbour when the Pharos fire was burning, and the library was full, and the scholars were arguing in the Exedra about the correct text of a Sophocles play, or the precise circumference of the earth, or whether the sun moved around the earth, or the earth around the sun. The light is the same, the knowledge is not. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Alexandria. Not that knowledge is fragile, though it is, and not that institutions are temporary, though they are, but that the light and the knowledge are not the same thing, and that losing one does not extinguish the other. The light on the water endures. The impulse that built the library endures. The belief that it is worth gathering the world's knowledge in one place and making it available endures. And in that endurance, something of Alexandria endures too. Not in the stones which are gone, but in the continuing human insistence that what was found is worth finding again, that what was known is worth knowing again, that the light in the Pharos was worth tending even after no one could quite remember why it had been lit. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.